Sirte, Libya. October 20th, 2011. A man who ruled this country for 42 years is trying to escape the city. Muammar Gaddafi, the one Western leaders called a villain, then an ally, then a villain again, is trying to reach the local desert to regroup. He will never make it there. Rebels intercept his convoy on a broken road outside the city. The man who once enjoyed the honor of well-trained bodyguards and official receptions is captured by men with pistols, people he never knew personally. At this moment, the world celebrates. On television screens worldwide, liberal politicians are delighted by the news of political collapse. NATO officers discuss how their operation was ethical, just about humanitarian aid. The US president borrows a phrase from history: "We came, we saw, he fell." This is triumph. But is it really triumph? Libya has the fourth largest oil reserves in Africa. And maybe that's where the whole mystery lies? Back to Tripoli, Libya, 1911. The world looked different 100 years ago. Libya wasn't Libya. It was Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, remote provinces of the Ottoman Empire, where Turkish authority was stretched so thin it was barely visible. The population lived as it lived: merchants, nomads, fishermen. Nobody particularly cared what was officially there. Power is what you can hold by force or persuasion. For the Turks, there was neither anymore. Then Italy came. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a methodical process, like an entrepreneur evaluating land before buying. Italy was a state just forming as a separate entity, and it needed a colony, the last chance to grab territory before the global map was completely divided. On December 4th, 1911, Italian ships landed troops in Tobruk. Brief bombardment, then occupation of coastal stretches. On November 1st of that same year, Italy officially declared its authority over the territory, though in reality it only controlled the port cities. Everything beyond the ports remained shrouded in resistance. 30 years of Italian occupation on Libyan territory brought what occupation always brings: infrastructure development to extract resources, settlement of Italian colonists, an administrative structure that ignored local reality. Roads were built to export goods. Rule was established to ensure order. That order, it turned out, was violent. In southern Libya, resistance erupted. A man named Omar Mukhtar, a holy man and a military commander, organized an uprising against Italian rule. He didn't send letters to diplomats. He didn't send telegrams. He organized people who didn't want to be occupied and gave them a vision of resistance. Italian Governor Rodolfo Graziani, who had a reputation as a man without mercy toward those who resisted, arrived with one order: stop what could be stopped by any means necessary. Omar Mukhtar fought for 20 years. For another 20 years, people followed his vision. Eventually, the Italians captured him in 1931. By then, the resistance was already practically crushed. But Omar Mukhtar remained a legend, a man who did not surrender, a man who resisted occupation. This myth would be important later. Tripoli, Libya, 1951. World War II had ended. Italy lost. France and Britain were exhausted. A new world order was in effect. The USA on one side, the Soviet Union on the other. Both wanted influence in the Mediterranean. Both understood that colonialism could no longer be directly defended before the world. So the Libyans were given independence. Not because they won, though armed groups languished in the desert, but because the world's owners decided it would be more convenient. At the head of the new state, they placed King Idris I, a man who maintained friendly contacts with both the British and the New World Order. He was convenient, predictable, not a revolutionary. Libya became a monarchy, and the monarchy chose stability over change. At that moment, nobody knew about oil. Libya was a poor agrarian state. Nomads and merchants. That was all that existed. Then, in 1959, American intelligence discovered something beneath the desert. Something very valuable. Tripoli, Libya, 1961 to 1969. In 10 years, a territory that was one of the poorest in the region became one of the richest. Oil wells pierced the earth from the Atlantic to the Gulf of Sirte. International consortiums arrived with engineers, equipment, money. King Idris I suddenly became a small, wealthy king sitting atop a golden drip. The problem with a drip: it feeds the local elite but doesn't feed ordinary people. Oil companies, controlled by British and American corporations, received concessions. The king got a percentage of every barrel. Local workers got jobs in dusty environments without safety standards and wages set by foreigners. Corruption bloomed like roses on a sunny day. Ministers grabbed land for pennies and then sold it to foreign companies for fortunes. Profits were divided among palace-dwelling monarchical elites with no benefit to the countless abandoned villages in the southern desert. Over decades, the king signed contracts guaranteeing that most profits would go to foreign companies. This was standard neo-colonial order. They called it independence. A young man watched this picture. His name was Muammar Gaddafi. He was an officer in the Libyan army, the son of an ordinary officer, a man without the privileges of family connections and corporate doors. He barked out a rebellion in one phrase. Why did his people's wealth remain in the pockets of foreigners? Tripoli, Libya, September 1st, 1969. Gaddafi planned the coup for years. He wasn't naive. He understood that a simple declaration wouldn't be enough. He needed an army that trusted him. He needed a small network of officers who shared his vision. He waited for the day when the king would be out of the country. On September 1st, the king was in Turkey for treatment. Army cadets were stationed in barracks throughout Tripoli and Benghazi. A sunny morning became a turning point of power. Media was taken without bloodshed. Government institutions were seized by young officers. The king learned about his own coup over the radio from Turkey. Gaddafi, a 27-year-old boy, stepped onto a balcony and announced the revolution. He called it the Libyan Revolution. He said it was for Libya, for Libya's wealth, for the Libyan people's just claims. King Idris died in exile in Greece in 1983, never returning home. At this moment, Western governments were bewildered. They had a revolutionary. Revolutionaries rarely play by the established rules. Tripoli, Libya, 1969 to 1979. The first thing Gaddafi did was establish a governing theory he called the Green Book. The theory was simple. Power should be distributed, oil should serve the people, and Western imperialism should stop interfering in the country's affairs. This sounded revolutionary. People took to the streets hungry for something that looked like justice. But Gaddafi wasn't a naive man. He didn't just talk about distributing wealth. He actually did it, though not necessarily toward better governance. Education became free. Medicine became free. Workers got shares in oil operations. The state began building social networks that didn't exist before. On the surface, this looked like progress. The problem was that progress was controlled by one man. Gaddafi didn't play parliamentary games. He didn't rely on separate branches of power. It was personal rule, dressed in revolutionary clothes. What Gaddafi built was efficient but fragile. Like an inverted pyramid, all power at the top dependent on one personality. On the world stage, the world was divided. NATO states were outraged. The Soviet Union was pleased. This was a convenient ally on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. Libya exported oil in large quantities. Money flowed in. Gaddafi invested in the military, in education, in healthcare. Other African states looked at him as a hero, a man standing against Western plunderers. There was both truth and lies in this, Tripoli and the region. 1970 to 1989. A revolutionary, as is fitting, can't sit still. Gaddafi discovered that controlling Libya wasn't enough for him. His vision was pan-Arab, pan-African, even pan-American, in the sense that the USA shouldn't control developing countries. He supported guerrilla groups in the region. He sent weapons. He sent money. He sent military instructors. In the West, they started calling him a state sponsor of terrorism, a phrase convenient for designating someone you don't like who has enough money to arm other people you don't like either. The United States responded the way it does, with sanctions. When you refuse to play by our rules, we stop you through financial isolation. We tell your banks not to trade with you. We tell your companies not to buy from you. We tell international creditors not to lend you money. Libya was barely harmed. It had something more valuable than international credit, oil wells. But in 1986, something happened. An American F-111 bomber crossed the Mediterranean sky and dropped bombs on Tripoli. The target, according to the American government, was terrorist objects. Gaddafi, they said, was involved in a nightclub bombing in Berlin, where several American soldiers were killed. Tripoli burned. People fled. Gaddafi survived in an underground bunker, as any lucky dictator would. This was a moment when something broke in Gaddafi's system of power. Missiles didn't satisfy anybody's Green Book ideology. Western states continued to view him as an enemy, despite his attempts to show he was simply defending his sovereignty. Gaddafi remained in power. His system remained intact, but the ideology was compromised. Tripoli, Libya. 2000 to 2008. The world changed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union fell into pieces of geopolitical defeat. NATO expanded, sealing Eastern European spaces. A new power configuration was being observed but wasn't yet apparent. Gaddafi looked at the world map and understood that the very concept of a revolutionary as opposition to the Western global order had become ethically disadvantageous. The puzzle was changing. In the early 2000s, Gaddafi makes a turn, not in ideology but in practice. He releases several British guards who had been detained on suspicion of attacks. This wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a gesture. He begins diplomatic negotiations with the USA. He allows international oil companies to resume operations on Libyan territory, which had been stopped due to sanctions. He invites foreign investment. NATO governments start playing near him. People like Tony Blair show up, flying to Tripoli to meet a man he called his most brutal enemy 15 years earlier. This was money and interest, dressed up in diplomacy. Gaddafi allowed Western companies close to his oil. NATO allowed him to stay in power. An unwritten contract built on an oil foundation. His son, Saif al-Islam, began appearing at international conferences, talking about reforms and liberalism. This looked like a soft transition to an open society. In reality, it was a process of naturalization by Western financial interests who wanted access to Libyan oil without the complications of revolutionary language. The trend was simple. Gaddafi stays in power if he allows Western companies to extract oil on terms acceptable to their investors. Everything else, reforms, democracy, human rights, was financed rhetoric. By 2008, Libya was integrated back into the Western global order, just as in 1951, but with a better actor in the leadership role. Benghazi, Libya. February 2011. Spring 2011 came in the form of the Arab Spring, a series of revolutionary movements that erupted across the Arab East. Social networks helped young people organize. In Tunisia, the president fled to Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, people occupied squares and demanded change. In Libya, people did the same, but Libya had no experience with revolution. In a country freed from 40 years of dictatorship, people had no template for how a revolution is conducted. Protests began in Benghazi, in the eastern part of Libya, in a city that symbolized resistance long ago, from the time of Omar Mukhtar. At first, these were ordinary demonstrations. People took to the streets demanding better working conditions, fighting corruption, some degree of democracy. Gaddafi viewed all this as a call to instinct. People he ruled were saying they knew how to govern themselves. His reaction was as conservative as always: suppress. Army units received orders to disperse public gatherings. At first, it seemed like standard bloody tactics. But something was different. Gaddafi's loyal officers from outside Benghazi picked up signals of discontent from local military. Suppression turned into confrontation. Confrontation turned into armed conflict. At this point, local police couldn't hold the situation. Army generals asked the center for permission for larger military operations. Gaddafi gave permission. The army began artillery bombardment of towns in the east. People began going underground. This was no longer a demonstration. This was civil conflict. New York and London. March 2011. In secret offices of intelligence services in London and New York, people looked at abbreviated reports about Libya. They saw a revolutionary who viewed his own people as a license to do what he wanted. But the people making decisions about intervention didn't talk about Libya as a place where people suffered. They talked about Libya as a place where geopolitical shifts were occurring. Russia remained an unresolved question. China remained an uncertain question. Oil remained an uncertain question. NATO countries voted for a UN Security Council resolution establishing a no-fly zone over Libya. Officially, this meant stopping government airstrikes on rebels. In reality, it meant the right to decide what rules to establish on a small African territory. French F-16 arrived first. They knocked out strategic positions of the Libyan army advancing from the west. British Tornadoes, American F-15s, Italian helicopters all arrived under the banner of protecting civilians. The problem lay in defining the term civilian population. The Libyan army consisted of people recruited locally, who had families, who lived under civilian roofs. When a British bomber dropped a missile on a military base near Tripoli, the line between military and civilian targets blurred like sand under ocean waves. The story was told this way: NATO countries were saving innocent people from a dictator. The story was told in the light of humanitarian values, human rights, protection from barbarism. But if you try to view justice as something more than words, the outcome forces you to ask, was this really a rescue operation? Or was it a geopolitical game where people were just chess pieces on a board? At the moment when the Libyan army was advancing on Benghazi, the picture looked like Gaddafi was holding control. At the moment when the first French missiles fell on Tripoli, the picture changed radically. Now there were good odds that the rebels would emerge from this conflict as victors. Tripoli, Libya. June 2011. What happened next would be presented this way. A revolutionary army, reinforced by NATO, began turning the Libyan face against Gaddafi's Western positions. But details are always more complex. When speaking of a revolutionary army, one talks about a crowd from outside Benghazi, where institutional power didn't exist. About people who took to the streets 7 months earlier, when it was unclear whether they would conduct a revolution or be dispersed. About people who had no unified command, no single ideology, no clear vision of what would happen the next day. They had many factions. Some were liberal, some were religious, some were criminal. NATO countries made clear to themselves that they didn't care who came to power. NATO cared that oil continued to flow in directions suitable for their economy. As the Libyan army advanced from the west toward Benghazi, complexities became apparent. People who previously opposed Gaddafi now protested against their own allies. Second, it became clear that the revolutionary army included groups that were hard to present as good guys. They had people from al-Qaeda networks, people who previously fought in Afghanistan, people NATO itself considered terrorists a few years earlier. This was inconvenient, since NATO was operating on the premise that it was fighting terrorism, not with terrorists. Solution: just don't talk about it. A media operation was launched smoothly. NATO communicators mediated the narrative. This was an operation protecting people. Everything else was just details. Details were money. Benghazi, Sirte, Tripoli, August to October 2011. Over 9 months of civil war, the state fell apart. Not along geopolitical lines, not along previously ideological ones, but by local force. Militias formed around fishermen, farmers, simply armed men who thought they should defend their territorial area. Libya didn't have a national army that started as an army and ended as an army. It had a crowd of armed men that people called an army by accident. NATO continued bombing. As Gaddafi's government army ran out of ammunition, NATO expanded domains, expanded targets, expanded whom it considered suitable for combat. By late August, government quarters in Tripoli were filled with armed men positioned on central squares. Gaddafi's people were patiently squeezed into separate districts, lacking the connections of previous days. By early October, separate groups of Libyan rebels rationalized themselves in Sirte, the last city where Gaddafi held out. Gaddafi left Tripoli days earlier, tried to escape through the desert on beaten-up roads, where he hoped to regroup in southern Libya. On the road, he was intercepted by people he didn't prepare for, people he never understood. He was taken out of his vehicle. He was dragged onto the road. Thus ended the era of one man, but thus began something far more complex. Sirte, Benghazi, Tripoli, October 2011. The world celebrated. CNN broadcast images of people on the streets of Libya, waving flags, raising their hands to the sky, repeating that the revolution had won. What happened to Libya after Gaddafi? Tripoli, Libya, October 2011. When the fever of celebration subsided, Libyans found themselves facing a problem: how to govern a country without institutions. The man was removed. The system was taken apart. Everything else was left empty. Within days, cities fell apart into territories controlled by armed groups. Revolutionaries who united against one man had no shared vision of the future. In place of centralized power came dozens of local authorities with their own rules and ambitions. Gaddafi built a system around himself. When he was removed, it collapsed. There was no alternative structure, no distributed power, no institutions independent of his command. The army fell apart into groups. Police became militias. Bureaucracy became people who didn't know who they answered to. Loyalty shifted from a national idea to tribal connections, religious networks, simply people they knew. Militias seized oil ports, not from ideology, from a practical reason. There was money there. Instead of centralized export, a dozen exports controlled by militias. Instead of one budget, hundreds of budgets. Money went not to education and medicine, but to weapons and fighter salaries. Gaddafi's economy, however brutal, ensured minimum survival. The economy of anarchy ensured nothing. People starved, got sick, died from things developed, states solve. Russia, Turkey, Egypt, the Emirates, France looked at Libya. Each established client structures for their own interests. General Haftar in the east received money from Egypt, the Emirates, France, Russia. The government in Tripoli, support from Turkey. Libya became not a state but a terrain of a game between great powers. Was removing Gaddafi a mistake? Gaddafi suppressed opposition, ran a centralized system, but after him came not freedom but anarchy. In anarchy, there are no rules. Armed groups do what they want. The question of whether it was right to remove Gaddafi is interesting now. One thing is perfectly clear: Libyans paid a price then, and they continue to pay.